The origins of the Avro Lancaster can be traced to the early years of the Second World War, when the Royal Air Force confronted the inadequacy of its existing bomber force. In 1939, the backbone of Bomber Command consisted of twin-engined aircraft such as the Vickers-Wellington, Armstrong-Whitworth-Whitley, and Handley-Page-Hampton. These machines, though capable in limited roles, lacked the payload, range, and survivability required to mount a sustained strategic bombing campaign against Germany. The early daylight raids of 1939 and 1940, carried out with small numbers of these bombers, ended in heavy losses to German fighters and flak. RAF leadership quickly recognized that the long war ahead demanded heavy, four-engine bombers capable of carrying large bomb loads deep into enemy territory under the cover of night. Avro, led by chief designer Roy Chadwick, initially entered the heavy bomber field with the Manchester, a twin-engine design powered by Rolls-Royce Vulture engines. Conceived in the late 1930s, the Manchester was intended to be a long-range replacement for the earlier medium bombers. However, the Vulture engine proved disastrously unreliable. Its complex 24-cylinder configuration suffered from persistent overheating, lubrication failures, and catastrophic breakdowns. Between 1940 and 1941, Manchesters were plagued with losses not from enemy action, but from mechanical failures. Crews referred to the aircraft as dangerous, and by mid-1941, the Manchester program was effectively doomed. Yet within this failure lay the seeds of a breakthrough. Chadwick recognized that the Manchester's airframe had untapped potential. Rather than discard the design entirely, he proposed a radical re-engining, replacing the two Vultures with four Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, already proving their reliability in the Supermarine Spitfire and Hawker Hurricane fighters. This change required substantial redesign. The wingspan was extended from 90 to 102 feet, the fuselage strengthened, and fuel capacity expanded. The resulting aircraft, initially known as the Manchester Mark III, became the prototype for what would be renamed the Lancaster. The timing of this innovation aligned with the strategic imperatives of 1941. The Battle of Britain had secured Britain from invasion but left the island nation isolated. The only way to strike directly at Germany was through strategic bombing. Churchill's government and Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris, soon to become head of Bomber Command, envisioned a campaign that would disrupt German industry, cripple morale, and force Hitler to divert resources to homeland defense. Such a strategy demanded a bomber with extraordinary capacity, and the Lancaster, still on the drawing board, seemed capable of fulfilling this need. The shift to four Merlins solved the key technical problem that had doomed the Manchester. Each Merlin delivered around 1,280 horsepower in early versions, giving the Lancaster a combined output of more than 5,000 horsepower. This power transformed the aircraft's performance, enabling it to carry unprecedented bomb loads. Where the Manchester had struggled to carry 4,000 pounds, the Lancaster could transport over twice that amount in standard configurations. And in special modifications, bomb loads of up to 22,000 pounds, including the massive Grand Slam earthquake bomb. The Lancaster's design embodied a pragmatic balance between capacity, endurance, and survivability. Its long, unobstructed bomb bay allowed it to carry not only large conventional loads, but also specialized ordnance. The fuselage, though relatively simple, provided enough space for a crew of 7: pilot, flight engineer, navigator, bomb aimer, wireless operator, and 2 gunners. Defensive armament included turrets in the nose, tail, and dorsal positions, typically armed with .303 Browning machine guns. While this armament was modest compared to American heavy bombers such as the B-17 Flying Fortress, the Lancaster compensated with speed, payload, and the doctrine of massed night bombing rather than unescorted daylight raids. By late 1941, the RAF faced a choice between competing heavy bomber designs, the Handley-Page Halifax, Short Stirling, and the Avro Lancaster. The Stirling, already in service, suffered from limited altitude capability due to its short wingspan. The Halifax offered good range and performance but lacked the Lancaster's bomb capacity. The emergence of the Lancaster quickly established it as the superior option. In production planning, priority was shifted toward Avro, and resources were allocated to scale up manufacturing across Britain. Thus, the Lancaster was born from the failure of the Manchester, shaped by the urgency of Britain's strategic needs, and realized through the ingenuity of Avro's engineers. It represented the convergence of a sound airframe design, the reliability of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, and the pressing demand for a weapon capable of striking at the heart of the Third Reich. As 1942 approached, the stage was set for the Lancaster to prove itself not merely as another bomber, but as the centerpiece of Bomber Command's campaign to burn the Reich's industrial might. The prototype phase of the Avro Lancaster began in the summer of 1941, when the first Manchester Mark III, later designated the Lancaster, took to the air. On 9 January 1941, the prototype BT-308 made its maiden flight from Ringway Airport near Manchester, piloted by Avro's chief test pilot, H.A. Bill Thorne. Immediately, the transformation was apparent. The addition of 4 Rolls-Royce Merlins had eliminated the chronic power deficiencies of the Manchester. The aircraft climbed smoothly, handled predictably, and demonstrated stability in both cruising and diving conditions. Test pilots described it as responsive and well-balanced for a bomber of its size, a significant contrast to the Manchester's dangerous flight characteristics. The Ministry of Aircraft Production quickly recognized the aircraft's promise. By early 1941, the RAF was preparing for large-scale night bombing campaigns, but its current fleet of Stirlings and Halifaxes was proving inadequate in payload and altitude performance. The Lancaster seemed to offer the answer. Official trials at Boscombe Down confirmed its superiority, with evaluators noting that the Lancaster could carry 14,000 pounds of bombs over 1,000 miles, while still retaining better maneuverability than any other British heavy bomber. Its unobstructed bomb bay, stretching 33 feet, was particularly praised, as it allowed for the carriage of unusually large and varied bomb loads. The early prototypes, BT-308 and BT-309, underwent intensive testing throughout 1941. Engineers refined details such as turret placement, control systems, and fuel distribution. The first prototypes carried nose, dorsal, and tail turrets, each fitted with twin .303 Browning machine guns, while later production models standardized with 4 guns in the tail for added defensive strength. Defensive firepower was limited compared to American bombers, but the British strategy of night operations reduced exposure to enemy fighters, making payload and endurance the higher priorities. Transition from prototype to production was rapid, reflecting wartime urgency. Avro's main plant at Chatterton and Woodford was soon joined by shadow factories operated by Metropolitan Vickers, Armstrong Whitworth, and Vickers Armstrong to accelerate output. By October 1941, the first production Lancaster, designated the BI, rolled off the assembly line. Unlike the prototype, which used Merlin X engines, production aircraft were equipped with Merlin XX engines providing around 1,480 horsepower each. This further improved performance, enabling a top speed of nearly 280 miles per hour at 15,000 feet and a service ceiling exceeding 23,000 feet. Test crews evaluated the Lancaster in bombing trials, including accuracy tests with 1,000-pound and 2,000-pound bombs. Results were encouraging. The aircraft's stability in level flight and its ability to descend into shallow dives improved accuracy compared to earlier British heavy bombers. The Lancaster was also tested with special loads, including 4,000-pound blockbuster bombs designed to devastate urban areas. Its capacious bomb bay meant it could carry these without modification, something the Stirling could not achieve due to its limited fuselage dimensions. Pilots transitioning from the Manchester to the Lancaster remarked on the dramatic improvement. The Manchester's underpowered engines had forced risky takeoffs and poor climb performance, often dooming crews if one engine failed. In contrast, the Lancaster's 4 Merlins provided both redundancy and power, allowing it to continue flying even with one engine out. This feature alone greatly boosted crew confidence as survivability increased dramatically. Operational evaluations were carried out with early production models delivered to No. 44 Squadron at Waddington in late 1941. Training flights confirmed the Lancaster's ability to handle long-range missions, heavy payloads, and adverse weather conditions common in Northern Europe. Reports from squadron leaders emphasized that, unlike the Stirling or Halifax, the Lancaster felt like an aircraft designed from the ground up for strategic bombing rather than a compromise. By the end of 1941, confidence in the design was so high that the Air Ministry placed massive production orders. It was decided that the Lancaster would become the primary heavy bomber of Bomber Command, replacing the Manchester entirely and gradually supplanting the Stirling. Production was prioritized under the British war economy, and by early 1942, Lancasters were entering frontline squadrons in growing numbers. The testing era of the Lancaster thus bridged the gap between failure and triumph. What began as a desperate reconfiguration of the Manchester had, within a year, produced a bomber that exceeded expectations. Its trials confirmed not only its technical superiority, but its suitability for the kind of campaign Bomber Command was preparing to wage. With production now secured, the Lancaster was ready to move from the test fields into combat, where it would earn its reputation as the bomber that burned the Reich. The Lancaster's entry into service coincided with a critical juncture in the air war over Europe. In early 1942, Bomber Command was preparing to expand night operations, shifting from limited, often symbolic raids to large-scale, sustained bombing campaigns aimed at crippling Germany's industrial capacity. The Lancaster entered this context as the weapon designed to deliver decisive blows. Its first operational deployment came with No. 44 Squadron, based at RAF Waddington in Lincolnshire, which received its initial batch of aircraft in late 1941. By March 1942, these Lancasters flew their first mission, a daylight raid against the city of Essen. The debut mission highlighted both the aircraft's strengths and the doctrinal changes underway within Bomber Command. While Essen was heavily defended, the Lancaster demonstrated its ability to reach the target with a substantial bomb load. Though damage in this early raid was limited, the mission marked the beginning of the Lancaster's combat career. Within weeks, other squadrons, such as No. 97 Squadron at Woodhall Spa, began receiving the aircraft. The speed of deployment reflected the RAF's determination to replace the underperforming Sterling and the phased-out Manchester with a bomber capable of sustained deep penetration strikes. Crew reactions to the Lancaster were overwhelmingly positive compared to their experiences with earlier heavy bombers. Pilots praised its stability and power, particularly during takeoff when fully loaded, a dangerous moment in the Manchester. Navigators appreciated the spacious fuselage, which allowed them to operate with greater efficiency on long missions. Gunners valued the improved defensive layout, though they acknowledged that the 303 Brownings lacked the punch of heavier caliber weapons used by American aircraft. Still, crews quickly grew to trust the Lancaster's speed and maneuverability as their primary means of defense. Operational doctrine for the Lancaster was rooted in massed night raids. Unlike the U.S. Army Air Forces, which pursued daylight precision bombing, the RAF under Air Marshal Arthur Harris prioritized night saturation bombing. The Lancaster fit this doctrine perfectly, able to carry massive loads of incendiaries and high-explosive bombs in long-range missions to Germany's industrial heartland. Its large bomb bay, capable of accommodating a wide variety of ordnance, made it uniquely versatile. In practice, early missions often carried combinations of 4,000-pound blockbusters with clusters of smaller incendiaries designed to ignite firestorms in German cities. As squadrons transitioned to Lancasters, early operations confirmed the aircraft's role as the new backbone of Bomber Command. In April 1942, a Lancaster flew a daring daylight raid against Augsburg, deep in southern Germany, targeting the MAN diesel engine works. The mission demonstrated the aircraft's range and striking power, though losses were high due to daylight fighter interception. While Bomber Command concluded that daylight raids were too costly, the Augsburg mission reinforced the Lancaster's ability to deliver precision strikes when necessary. By mid-1942, Lancasters were participating in increasingly ambitious night raids. One of the earliest large-scale tests came in the first 1,000-bomber raid on Cologne in May 1942. Although only a fraction of the bombers involved were Lancasters, their role stood out. Their ability to carry heavier loads than other types meant that even in smaller numbers, they contributed disproportionately to the destruction inflicted. The Cologne raid caused widespread devastation, both physically and psychologically, marking the beginning of an intensified strategic bombing campaign. Bomber Command leaders quickly realized that the Lancaster's performance could shift the balance in the air war. Production orders were accelerated, with the goal of equipping the majority of frontline squadrons as quickly as possible. By late 1942, increasing numbers of operations featured Lancasters as the primary force, often outnumbering Halifaxes and Sterlings in formations. The entry of the Lancaster into service also coincided with the formation of specialized units tasked with testing new bombing techniques. Among these were squadrons later assigned to 617 Squadron, the famous Dam Busters. The Lancaster's large bomb bay and strong structure allowed it to be adapted for experimental ordnance, something that became a hallmark of its service. This adaptability would soon set the Lancaster apart not just as a conventional bomber, but as the platform for some of the war's most innovative missions. By the end of 1942, the Lancaster had transitioned from a promising newcomer to the centerpiece of Bomber Command's strategy. Crews, commanders, and planners alike understood that it was the aircraft that could carry the war into the Reich on a scale previously impossible. Its early operational use laid the foundation for a bombing campaign that would escalate in both intensity and devastation, turning the Lancaster into the defining weapon of Britain's strategic air offensive. The period from late 1942 into 1943 marked the Lancaster's transition from a promising heavy bomber into the dominant weapon of Britain's air offensive. With Bomber Command steadily expanding its force structure, the Lancaster became central to the RAF's campaign to destroy German industry and infrastructure. The aircraft's capacity to deliver massive bomb loads over long distances made it indispensable in the strategy of area bombing, which aimed not only to damage factories, but also to undermine civilian morale and disrupt the German war economy. One of the Lancaster's defining missions came in the spring of 1943 with Operation Chastise, the famous Dambusters raid. Carried out by the newly formed No. 617 Squadron, this mission targeted the Ruhr dams, key sources of water and hydroelectric power for Germany's industrial heartland. The Lancaster's large bomb bay allowed it to carry the specially designed Upkeep bouncing bomb developed by Barnes-Wallis. On the night of 16 to 17 May 1943, 19 Lancasters flew the mission, breaching both the Möhne and Eder dams. The floods caused significant destruction, though industrial output was restored within months. Still, the raid demonstrated the Lancaster's ability to undertake highly specialized missions, cementing its reputation as a versatile strike platform. At the same time, Lancasters were flying nightly raids against German cities as part of the broader strategic bombing campaign. Between 1942 and 1945, they became the primary delivery vehicle for 4,000-pound cookies and incendiary clusters designed to ignite firestorms. Operations against Hamburg in July 1943, known as Operation Gomorrah, illustrated the destructive potential of massed Lancaster formations. Over several nights, more than 700 Lancasters dropped thousands of tons of high explosives and incendiaries, igniting a firestorm that destroyed large portions of the city and killed tens of thousands of civilians. This raid marked the first use of window, aluminum strips dropped to confuse German radar, further improving the survivability of the bomber streams. The Lancaster's combat role also included deep penetration raids into heavily defended regions. Berlin, Essen, Cologne, and Nuremberg all became repeated targets. The Battle of Berlin, conducted between November 1943 and March 1944, saw more than 9,000 sorties flown by Lancasters. Losses were heavy, sometimes exceeding 7% in a single night, but the campaign inflicted immense destruction on the German capital. Although Bomber Command did not break German morale as hoped, the sustained offensive forced Germany to divert enormous resources into air defense, including thousands of anti-aircraft guns and night fighters, weakening other fronts. Despite the heavy risks, crews recognized that the Lancaster offered the best chance of survival compared to other RAF heavy bombers. Its higher speed and greater altitude performance made it more difficult for German night fighters to intercept. Furthermore, its ability to carry diverse bomb loads allowed it to adapt to different target requirements. Crews grew accustomed to missions lasting 7 or 8 hours, flying deep into Germany in tight formations guided by Pathfinder squadrons that marked targets with flares. By 1944, the Lancaster was increasingly used for precision operations as well as area bombing. The introduction of specialized bombs such as the 12,000-pound Tallboy and the 22,000-pound Grand Slam gave Bomber Command the ability to destroy hardened targets like submarine pens, viaducts, and even warships. Once again, the Lancaster's cavernous bomb bay proved decisive. It was the only Allied bomber capable of carrying such weapons. These missions targeted strategic infrastructure that could not be destroyed by conventional bombing, including the sinking of the German battleship Tirpitz in late 1944. Tactically, Bomber Command refined its use of Lancaster formations to reduce losses. The use of bomber streams, concentrated paths of aircraft flying within narrow time windows, saturated German radar and air defenses, making interceptions less effective. Navigation aids such as G, oboe, and H2S radar improved bombing accuracy, further enhancing the Lancaster's effectiveness. Although the strategy of area bombing remained controversial, there is little doubt that the Lancaster made these tactics viable on the scale required. Through 1943 and 1944, the Lancaster had become not merely a heavy bomber, but the centerpiece of Britain's strategic war effort. It was the aircraft that carried the RAF's bombing offensive from symbolic raids to devastating assaults, capable of delivering destruction unmatched by any other Allied bomber in Europe. Its adaptability to both area and precision missions ensured that it could be deployed against cities, industry, transport networks, and even naval targets. In the words of many commanders, it was the bomber that gave Britain a weapon of strategic reach, transforming the RAF into an offensive force capable of striking at the heart of the Reich on an unprecedented scale. The Lancaster's success lay not only in its combat record, but also in the adaptability of its design. From the earliest BI variants to the late war specialized bombers, the aircraft evolved continuously to meet new demands. This flexibility allowed it to serve as a platform for innovations that no other Allied heavy bomber could carry, and it ensured the Lancaster's relevance from its introduction in 1942 until the final raids of 1945. The main production version, the Lancaster BI, powered by Rolls-Royce Merlin XX engines, became the standard workhorse of Bomber Command. Later models incorporated improved Merlins such as the 22 and 24 series, which increased reliability and high-altitude performance. The Lancaster B3, virtually identical to the BI, substituted Packard-built Merlin 28 engines manufactured under license in the United States. This model ensured that production could be sustained even when British engine factories were at maximum capacity. Together, the BI and B3 formed the backbone of Bomber Command, accounting for the majority of the 737 Lancasters produced during the war. As the bombing campaign intensified, engineers developed variants to carry increasingly heavy and specialized ordnance. The Lancaster BI Special was modified with strengthened bomb bays and reduced defensive armament to accommodate the 12,000-pound Tallboy bomb and later the 22,000-pound Grand Slam. These earthquake bombs, designed by Barnes-Wallis, were used against heavily fortified targets such as U-boat pens, viaducts, and concrete shelters. Only the Lancaster could deliver such weapons, giving the RAF a unique capability that even American heavy bombers like the B-17 and B-24 could not match. Other variants addressed specific operational needs. The Lancaster B-2 replaced the Merlin engines with Bristol Hercules radial engines to mitigate shortages of Merlins during peak production periods. Though it offered slightly reduced performance, the B-2 ensured uninterrupted supply of bombers. The Lancaster B-7 incorporated a redesigned rear turret with 4 303 Brownings, improving defensive firepower. Meanwhile, trainer versions such as the Lancaster BIFE and B7FE were adapted for service in the Far East, fitted with additional fuel tanks and tropical equipment to extend range in anticipation of operations against Japan. International production highlighted the Lancaster's significance. In Canada, Victory Aircraft built 430 Lancasters under license, known as the Lancaster BX. These aircraft, powered by Packard-built Merlins, were virtually identical to the B-3 but included some Canadian-manufactured components. Post-war, many of these Canadian-built Lancasters remained in service for training, transport, and maritime patrol, ensuring the type's longevity into the 1950s. The Lancaster's adaptability extended beyond bombing. Some aircraft were converted for maritime reconnaissance, fitted with radar and depth charges for anti-submarine warfare in the Battle of the Atlantic. Others were modified as transport aircraft, notably in Operation Exodus, which repatriated thousands of prisoners of war in 1945. A handful were adapted for photo reconnaissance, taking advantage of their range and payload capacity to carry advanced cameras for strategic intelligence gathering. Technological improvements were constant throughout production. Early navigation relied heavily on dead reckoning and celestial fixes, but later Lancasters incorporated sophisticated aids such as G, oboe, and H2S radar, which improved accuracy even in poor weather or through cloud cover. Electronic countermeasures, including radar jammers and chaff dispensers, were also fitted to confuse German air defenses. These upgrades kept the Lancaster at the cutting edge of bomber technology throughout the conflict. Specialized experiments pushed the Lancaster's limits even further. Modified examples were used to test jet engines, towing arrangements, and aerial refueling concepts. In some cases, stripped-down Lancasters acted as mother planes for experimental aircraft, showcasing the design's ability to serve as a platform for innovation well beyond its original role. By 1945, the Lancaster had become more than just a heavy bomber. It was a versatile platform capable of delivering the heaviest bombs in history, performing reconnaissance and maritime patrols, and supporting experimental aviation. Its ability to absorb modifications and improvements reflected both the foresight of Roy Chadwick's design and the adaptability of British wartime industry. This flexibility ensured that the Lancaster would remain relevant in both combat and post-war service, bridging the transition from piston-engine bombers to the emerging jet age. As the war in Europe drew to a close, the Avro Lancaster had established itself as the centerpiece of Britain's strategic bombing campaign and one of the most significant heavy bombers of the Second World War. By 1945, it was responsible for delivering 2/3 of all bombs dropped by Bomber Command, including the heaviest ordnance ever used in combat. Its contribution was both material and psychological. German industry had been battered by the relentless campaign, and German civilians associated the sound of Merlin engines overhead with destruction. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the Lancaster continued to serve in a variety of roles. It was employed in humanitarian missions such as Operation Manna, in which Lancasters dropped food supplies to starving Dutch civilians in April and May 1945. These flights demonstrated the aircraft's capacity not only to destroy, but also to deliver life-saving aid. Shortly thereafter, in Operation Exodus, Lancasters were used to repatriate Allied prisoners of war, carrying men who had endured years in German camps back to Britain. Both missions reflected the versatility of the aircraft and its adaptability to peacetime humanitarian needs. Despite the arrival of newer designs such as the Avro Lincoln, which was essentially an enlarged and improved Lancaster, the original bomber remained in service for years after the war. Lancasters equipped with radar and specialized gear were converted into maritime patrol aircraft, operating in the Battle of the Atlantic's closing stages and later in post-war surveillance duties. Others were adapted for photo reconnaissance, mapping vast regions of Europe and Asia during the late 1940s, when strategic intelligence remained a critical priority in the emerging Cold War. Internationally, the Lancaster's reach extended well beyond Britain. Canada's Royal Canadian Air Force retained many of the Canadian-built BX variants, using them extensively in transport, training, and maritime roles into the 1950s. France operated a number of Lancasters in its Air Force and naval aviation units, employing them primarily for maritime reconnaissance and bombing in colonial conflicts, including operations in Indochina. Australia also used the Lancaster post-war, both in combat operations and as a training platform, while several other Allied nations briefly operated the type in secondary roles. The Lancaster's post-war legacy was also defined by its symbolic importance. In Britain, it became an icon of Bomber Command's contribution to victory, though the strategic bombing campaign itself remained controversial. The destruction wrought on cities like Hamburg, Dresden, and Cologne raised enduring questions about the morality and effectiveness of area bombing. While proponents argued that the campaign diverted German resources, crippled transport networks, and contributed significantly to the eventual collapse of the Reich, critics pointed to the immense civilian casualties and questioned whether such devastation had been necessary. The Lancaster, as the main instrument of this policy, became inseparable from the debate. From a technological perspective, the Lancaster influenced the next generation of bombers. Its emphasis on payload capacity, adaptability for specialized weapons, and relatively simple but robust design philosophy carried forward into the Avro Lincoln and eventually into Britain's post-war jet bombers, such as the Vulcan. It provided a template for thinking about heavy bombers as flexible platforms capable of carrying unconventional weapons, a concept that would become central in the nuclear age. Preservation of the Lancaster in museums and airworthy displays has further reinforced its historical significance. Today, only 2 Lancasters remain operational, one in Britain with the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight, and one in Canada with the Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum. Their flights draw large crowds, serving as both tributes to the crews who flew them and as reminders of the scale of the air war. Static examples are preserved in museums across Europe, North America, and Australia, offering future generations the chance to study the machine that defined Britain's aerial offensive. In historical memory, the Avro Lancaster stands as both a triumph of wartime engineering and a symbol of the brutal realities of strategic bombing. It represented the ingenuity of designers like Roy Chadwick and the courage of the 7-man crews who undertook some of the most dangerous missions of the war. At the same time, it embodied the destructive potential of modern warfare, capable of leveling cities and reshaping entire landscapes. Its legacy is therefore twofold: as the bomber that burned the Reich and as a powerful reminder of the costs of total war. Even in the jet age, when piston-engine bombers quickly became obsolete, the Lancaster retained its cultural weight. It had been the weapon Britain needed at the critical moment, and its role in the Allied victory was undeniable. More than 70 years later, its engines still echo in commemorations, carrying with them the memory of a campaign that defined an era of aerial warfare. Beyond its well-documented role in the destruction of German industry and cities, the Avro Lancaster had several lesser-known chapters that revealed just how versatile and experimental the aircraft became during and after the war. These missions, often overshadowed by the scale of the night bombing campaign, highlight the ingenuity of engineers, the daring of crews, and the way the Lancaster became a testbed for ideas that would influence aviation for decades. One of the most striking examples was its use as a carrier for experimental weapons. The upkeep bouncing bomb employed in the Dambusters raid was only the beginning. Later in the war, Lancasters were modified to deliver the enormous Tallboy and Grand Slam bombs, precision-guided in concept if not in technology. These weapons, dropped from high altitude, penetrated hardened targets such as submarine pens and railway viaducts, creating localized destruction where thousands of conventional bombs might have failed. Crews of specialized squadrons became experts in these precision strikes, and their missions laid the groundwork for the kind of targeted air campaigns that would later become standard. Another overlooked role was maritime warfare. A number of Lancasters were converted into GR-3 and IMSAR-7 versions for coastal command. Equipped with radar, lee lights, and depth charges, they flew anti-submarine patrols over the Atlantic and Arctic. Though their numbers were limited compared to the dedicated consolidated B-24 Liberators, these Lancasters extended the RAF's reach, providing long-range cover for convoys and reinforcing Britain's ability to strangle Germany's U-boat campaign. This role continued into the post-war years, with Lancasters conducting maritime patrols during the early Cold War. The Lancaster also played a significant part in the early development of aerial reconnaissance. With their long range and ability to carry large camera payloads, Lancasters modified into PR, photo reconnaissance. Variants were dispatched deep into hostile territory. They documented German industrial centers, military installations, and transport hubs. These missions were often conducted at high altitudes and extreme ranges, beyond the reach of many other aircraft, providing critical intelligence for planners of both bomber command and ground campaigns. After 1945, similar aircraft were employed in mapping projects across Europe, Africa, and Asia, charting territories that had been under wartime occupation or remained poorly surveyed. In the immediate post-war years, the Lancaster found itself pressed into service in unexpected theaters. The French Air Force, for example, employed Lancasters during the First Indochina War, where they carried out bombing missions against Viet Minh positions. Though already outdated by the late 1940s, their heavy payload made them useful in colonial conflicts, where air superiority was uncontested. Canada retained Lancasters for long-range Arctic patrols, part of the broader Cold War effort to monitor northern approaches and develop early warning systems. Some Lancasters were adapted for experimental and research purposes. A handful were used as engine testbeds, carrying underslung jet engines such as the Rolls-Royce Nene or axial flow prototypes. These flights provided valuable data for Britain's transition into the jet age, directly influencing designs like the Canberra and the Vulcan. Others were used to experiment with aerial refueling, extended range flights, and even as motherships for launching experimental aircraft and drones. In this way, the Lancaster bridged the gap between the piston-driven bombers of the Second World War and the jet-powered innovations that followed. There were also forgotten humanitarian missions. Beyond Operation Manna in the Netherlands, Lancasters flew supply drops across devastated parts of Europe in 1945, delivering food, medical supplies, and even coal to regions where infrastructure had been destroyed. These operations rarely received the same publicity as combat missions, but they were vital in stabilizing war-torn populations and preventing famine during the chaotic months following Germany's surrender. The Lancaster's longevity in service was a testament to its sound design. Even as jet bombers entered production, Lancasters continued to fly into the 1950s in secondary roles. Their adaptability meant they could be found in transport squadrons, meteorological flights, and training units. For crews, serving on the Lancaster after the war often carried a symbolic weight. They were flying an aircraft that had become legendary, a machine remembered not only for the destruction it caused, but also for its extraordinary versatility. These less visible missions and adaptations remind us that the Lancaster was not just a bomber, but a platform for experimentation, reconnaissance, maritime defense, and humanitarian relief. They expand our understanding of its legacy, showing that it was more than simply the bomber that burned the Reich. It was an aircraft that bridged two eras of aviation, served across multiple continents, and adapted to tasks far beyond those envisioned when Roy Chadwick first reworked the ill-fated Manchester design. In these forgotten chapters, the Lancaster's influence proved even broader than the fiery destruction for which it is most remembered. By the late 1940s and into the 1950s, the Avro Lancaster had largely passed its prime as a frontline bomber, yet its influence continued to echo in both military and civil aviation. Its story after the Second World War is one of transition, from an essential weapon of total war to a multi-role aircraft that shaped early Cold War doctrine, supported scientific research, and entered the collective memory of nations as a symbol of sacrifice and resilience. In Britain, the Lancaster's direct successor was the Avro Lincoln, an enlarged and improved version designed to carry even heavier bomb loads over greater distances. The Lincoln inherited much from the Lancaster's design philosophy, from its straightforward airframe to its emphasis on payload capacity. While Lincolns became Bomber Command's primary heavy bomber in the immediate post-war years, dozens of Lancasters remained in service in supporting roles. They were used for training bomber crews, testing new navigation and radar systems, and conducting meteorological flights that collected atmospheric data during long-range missions. Some Lancasters also served as platforms for experimental research, flying with unusual payloads, sensors, or even suspended aircraft for aerodynamic testing. One of the most important contributions of the Lancaster in the early Cold War came through maritime patrol and anti-submarine warfare. Coastal Command, tasked with guarding the sea approaches to Britain, retained Lancaster variants such as the GR-3 and MR-7, which were equipped with long-range radar, sonobuoys, and depth charges. These aircraft flew patrols over the Atlantic and Arctic, monitoring Soviet submarine activity at a time when NATO feared the expansion of Soviet naval power. Although surpassed in performance by later aircraft, the Lancaster's endurance and spacious fuselage allowed it to carry the equipment needed for extended reconnaissance missions, making it an interim but valuable asset in maritime defense. Internationally, the Lancaster's post-war service reflected both the lingering importance of piston-engine bombers and the practical realities of nations rebuilding their air forces. Canada, having produced hundreds of Lancasters under license, retained them for years as maritime patrol aircraft, trainers, and transports. The Royal Canadian Air Force used them extensively in the Arctic, where their long range proved essential for mapping and monitoring vast, remote regions. In France, Lancasters were adapted for both naval and land-based bombing operations. They saw combat use in the First Indochina War, where they carried out strikes against Viet Minh positions in rugged terrain. Australia also operated the type post-war, keeping it in service until replaced by more modern designs in the early 1950s. Lancasters even appeared in civil aviation roles. A number of surplus aircraft were converted into Avro Lancastrians, stripped of armament and outfitted with passenger cabins or cargo holds. These aircraft flew with British Overseas Airways Corporation, BOAC, and other operators carrying mail, freight, and passengers along long-distance routes to Africa, Asia, and the Americas. While never as comfortable as purpose-built airliners, the Lancastrians demonstrated how a military design could be adapted for civilian purposes, bridging the gap between wartime production and post-war commercial needs. The Lancaster also became deeply enshrined in national memory, particularly in Britain and Canada. Its role in the great raids of the war, the Dams Raid, Hamburg, Berlin, Dresden, meant that it stood as a symbol of Bomber Command's sacrifice. More than 55,000 aircrew of Bomber Command were killed during the war, many of them Lancaster crews who faced daunting odds on every mission. For survivors and the families of the fallen, the aircraft came to embody both the courage and the cost of the strategic bombing campaign. As debates over the morality and effectiveness of area bombing grew in the post-war years, the Lancaster remained at the center of discussion. Critics argued that the destruction of German cities caused immense civilian suffering without decisively shortening the war, while defenders pointed out the strategic pressure the bombing exerted, forcing Germany to divert resources from the Eastern Front and accelerating its eventual collapse. The Lancaster, as the most effective British heavy bomber, was inseparable from these arguments. Despite such controversies, the Lancaster's cultural significance endured. Airworthy examples were preserved, and ceremonies often featured flypasts by the last operational aircraft. In Britain, the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight, formed in 1957, included a Lancaster as one of its centerpiece aircraft, flying alongside Spitfires and Hurricanes. In Canada, the Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum restored a Lancaster to flying condition, ensuring that future generations could see and hear the aircraft in flight. These surviving machines became not only museum pieces but living memorials, reminding audiences of the scale of the conflict and the human cost carried by bomber crews. By the 1960s, the Lancaster was gone from active service, but its legacy remained visible in multiple ways. In the design lineage of Avro bombers leading to the Vulcan, in its civilian adaptations that supported post-war air transport, and in the memory of the men who flew it. It had served in war, in peace, in science, and in humanitarian relief. As a bomber, it burned the Reich, but as a symbol, it came to stand for the resilience of a nation and the evolution of air power in the 20th century. By the 1970s, the Avro Lancaster had long since disappeared from active service, but its presence endured through memory, preservation, and historical debate. For many, the Lancaster was more than just a machine of war. It was a cultural touchstone, embodying both the triumph of British aviation engineering and the moral ambiguities of strategic bombing. This duality shaped its place in the post-war world. In Britain, commemorations of Bomber Command gradually gained recognition, although slower than those of Fighter Command. The valor of the bomber crews had often been overshadowed by the controversies surrounding area bombing, yet veterans groups worked tirelessly to preserve the memory of their service. At the center of these efforts was the Lancaster. Its iconic silhouette and the roar of its 4 Merlin engines became symbols of Bomber Command's contribution to the Allied victory. Flypasts by the Battle of Britain. Memorial flights Lancaster, maintained in airworthy condition since the late 1950s, became fixtures at air shows and national ceremonies. These appearances ensured that younger generations could witness the aircraft not only as a museum relic but as a living part of history. In Canada, the Lancaster held similar symbolic weight. Canadian aircrews had flown thousands of sorties in Lancasters during the war, and Canadian-built BX variants gave the aircraft a national dimension. The Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum's Lancaster, painstakingly restored to flying condition in the 1980s, became a centerpiece of Canadian aviation heritage. Its transatlantic flights and joint displays with the British Lancaster created powerful moments of remembrance, bridging 2 nations bound by shared sacrifice. Museums across the world sought to preserve examples of the aircraft. Static Lancasters were displayed in Britain, Canada, Australia, France, and Germany. Some were meticulously restored to wartime condition, complete with turrets and bomb bays, while others retained post-war modifications such as maritime reconnaissance fittings. For visitors, walking beneath the massive wings and bomb bay of a Lancaster provided a tangible sense of scale, connecting abstract statistics about bombing campaigns to the physical reality of the machine that carried them out. At the same time, historical research and debate over the bombing of Germany intensified. Historians examined the effectiveness of area bombing, questioning whether the destruction of cities like Hamburg and Dresden had materially shortened the war. The Lancaster, central to these operations, became an object of scrutiny. Its effectiveness in delivering massive payloads was beyond dispute. But its role in civilian casualties sparked ongoing ethical debates. Veterans often responded by emphasizing their own experiences, the nightly fear, the high loss rates, and the belief that their missions were necessary to defeat a ruthless enemy. In this way, the Lancaster became both a technical icon and a focal point for moral reflection. The aircraft's influence also extended into popular culture. Documentaries, films, and literature frequently depicted the Lancaster as the quintessential RAF bomber. The story of 617th Squadron and the Dam Busters raid, dramatized in books and the 1955 film The Dam Busters, ensured the aircraft's lasting fame. Although only one raid in the Lancaster's long wartime career, Operation Chastise became synonymous with ingenuity, bravery, and sacrifice. This singular mission kept the Lancaster in public consciousness far more vividly than statistics alone could. In the field of aviation history, the Lancaster remained a benchmark against which other bombers were measured. Comparisons with the American B-17 Flying Fortress or B-24 Liberator often highlighted differences in doctrine, the U.S. preference for daylight precision raids versus the RAF's emphasis on night area bombing. In terms of sheer payload capacity and adaptability, the Lancaster was frequently judged the most effective heavy bomber of the European theater. Its ability to carry specialized bombs like the Tallboy and Grand Slam placed it in a class of its own. The aircraft also continued to inspire technical interest. Aviation engineers and historians studied its design for insights into wartime production methods, aerodynamics, and structural integrity. The Lancaster's relatively straightforward design made it robust and adaptable, qualities that later aircraft designers sought to replicate in the jet age. Its ability to serve in so many roles, strategic bomber, maritime patrol aircraft, reconnaissance platform, and even civilian transport, demonstrated the value of designing with flexibility in mind. By the late 20th century, the Lancaster had firmly established itself as not only a historical artifact, but also a national symbol. For veterans, it was a reminder of comrades lost and missions survived. For historians, it was a case study in the application of strategic air power. For the public, it became part of the broader cultural memory of the Second World War, linking Britain's endurance on the home front with its offensive capability in the skies. Its legacy was no longer confined to the war itself, but had become part of how nations understood their own history, sacrifice, and resilience. Today, the Avro Lancaster stands as one of the most recognizable aircraft of the Second World War, a machine that combined engineering brilliance with the human cost of strategic bombing. Its legacy is layered: technological achievement, military effectiveness, cultural memory, and ethical debate. Each of these dimensions continues to shape how the Lancaster is remembered and studied in the 21st century. From a technological standpoint, the Lancaster represented the pinnacle of British piston-engine bomber design. Its adaptability to new weapons, from the 4,000-pound Cookie to the 22,000-pound Grand Slam, set it apart from every other Allied heavy bomber. The lessons learned in designing and operating such a versatile platform informed not only the Avro Lincoln and later British jet bombers, but also broader ideas about payload flexibility, modular design, and mission specialization. Engineers studying the Lancaster today see in it a bridge between the era of mass-produced piston bombers and the coming age of jet-powered strategic aircraft. The human dimension of the Lancaster's history remains central to its legacy. More than 55,000 men of Bomber Command were killed in action, the majority of them Lancaster crews flying deep into Germany night after night. Survival rates were grim. In some periods, a crew's chance of completing a 30-mission tour was less than 30%. For those who returned, the Lancaster became a symbol of both camaraderie and sacrifice. Memorials in Britain, Canada, and other Commonwealth nations preserve the names of the fallen, often alongside preserved Lancasters that serve as tangible reminders of their service. Culturally, the Lancaster occupies a place not unlike the Spitfire or Hurricane in Britain's wartime story. While the fighters symbolized survival during the Battle of Britain, the Lancaster represented the transition to the offensive, carrying the war into Germany itself. Its presence in documentaries, films, and literature ensures that it remains an enduring part of public imagination. Annual air displays featuring the Battle of Britain memorial flights Lancaster draw thousands, not only for the spectacle, but for the opportunity to hear and feel the aircraft as wartime generations once did. At the same time, the Lancaster remains inseparable from the moral debate surrounding strategic bombing. The destruction of Hamburg, Dresden, and other cities continues to spark discussion about the balance between military necessity and civilian suffering. Historians argue over whether Bomber Command's campaign decisively shortened the war, or whether it inflicted disproportionate damage without achieving its intended aims. In these debates, the Lancaster is both weapon and symbol, an aircraft that embodied the choices made by commanders and governments in a total war where boundaries between military and civilian targets blurred. Internationally, the Lancaster's reputation extends beyond Britain and the Commonwealth. In France, where Lancasters flew post-war in Indochina, and in Germany, where they were once a nightly terror, the aircraft forms part of national memory in different ways. For Canadians, Australians, and New Zealanders whose airmen flew thousands of missions in the type, it is a shared legacy of sacrifice that reinforced bonds within the Commonwealth. In museums across Europe and North America, the Lancaster serves as a focal point for discussions of wartime strategy, industrial production, and human endurance. In the 21st century, only 2 airworthy Lancasters remain, one in Britain and one in Canada. Their rare joint flights are seen as historic events, bringing together generations of veterans, historians, and the public in acts of remembrance. These flights ensure that the Lancaster is not merely a static exhibit, but a living piece of history, capable of inspiring reflection as powerfully as it did decades ago. Ultimately, the Lancaster's significance lies in its complexity. It was the bomber that burned the Reich, devastating German industry and cities. It was also the aircraft that carried food to starving civilians, that mapped continents in peacetime, and that helped shape the post-war aviation landscape. Its story intertwines triumph and tragedy, innovation and destruction, national pride and ethical reckoning. The Avro Lancaster remains more than an artifact of war. It is a testament to the technological ingenuity of its designers, the bravery of its crews, and the enduring questions of morality that surround the conduct of total war. In that sense, it continues to speak not only to the past, but to the challenges of remembering and understanding modern conflict itself.